FlyQuest's High, mid laner, formerly of Cloud9, is quite clearly one of the best shot callers in the history of League of Legends. Even when we take other regions, even famously Korea, which has obviously been the best region for the majority of the game, even in the context of the best Koreans, based on what we know and based on what we can see in terms of the effect on his teams in the game, High is right up there with the best that have ever played the game as an in-game leader, as a shot caller. You look at Season 4 Cloud9, the period beyond where they first broke onto the scene, and initially, in terms of the context of how good people were mechanically in NA, they were able to stay up to the standard of some of the top teams. Season 4 was when a bunch of people were better than mechanically. A bunch of, especially the Asian teams, were far ahead of them. But they still displayed world-class decision-making and in changing metas as you played around different positions, as the actual metagame of how you played macro style absolutely changed. But the problem is, obviously, they couldn't go deep internationally. They couldn't really make like a final of a Worlds. They couldn't potentially win a huge international tournament. But that was primarily down to player strength across the board pretty much. Almost every position had a player who wasn't as good as top Asian players at that, or sometimes even top EU players at their position. Now, in Season 5, Cloud9 was way worse. I mean, obviously, High wasn't even playing as a mid laner once we got to the summer. And in the context of the West, they were nowhere near what they used to be. But they still managed, by the end of the summer split, by the time the regional came along, to get wins, to be able to actually defeat much better opponents in terms of players, in terms of roster, in terms of actual performance during the season. Primarily because High was able to identify the few ways in which they could win. They no longer had a plethora of ways or all these possible decisions. They had to identify the few that were even possible in the context of what they had as a team and what the opponent had to offer, and therefore what the path towards any kind of victory was. But they were able to do so, therefore they were able to win the regional, they were able to get to Worlds, and at Worlds they were able to have that ridiculous first week where they got all those wins. His teams have always correctly emphasized the right carry in the team. This is something I think is remarkable because it's not just about shot calling. It's about how you see the game. Now, how much he had to do with this, we can't necessarily know. And certainly there was some group discussions and that people also had to sacrifice within the team and understand this. But if you look at all of the iterations of Cloud9 that High played within, including the different positions he was in, they always emphasized the lane that actually had the player who was playing in the context of his peers the best at that period of time, and usually within the meta was in some sense enabled and capable of carrying the game. That's how they could switch around. They could go from Meteos being this monster farming jungler to having Balls be this carry top laner and using it to push down objectives early to going to Sneaky in Season 4 being one of the best AD carries and a guy who, especially with that meta, if you think of the champions that were being used at AD carry, it really fit his time to kind of shine and be one of the best Western AD carries. Season after season, High has shown the ability to shot call regardless of the meta. Now, that doesn't mean he always adapted very quickly to the meta, or he always understood the meta, or he always had the pieces to be the best in the meta. But given enough time, he always did adapt, and his shot calling, once again, was activated, was effective, was something that actually could impact your chances of winning the game beyond just the players that you had and the champions that were picked for them in pick ban. He's someone where he's shown that he is good at reading the game. As the game unfolds, he sees what's happening, he sees what can happen, he sees what his team can do, he sees what is going on with the different champions, he sees the basic win conditions, so he reads the game, he takes information from his teammates, he seems to be someone who's very good at using actual verbal calls of his own in order to elicit the right information from his teammates. This is something he used to do as a mid laner quite well with his jungler, and as a result knows when it's possible for his team to rotate around the map, take objectives, when they can do dives, etc. Once he then has this information and has read the game, he is fantastic. Probably his best quality, as far as I can tell, is decisive calls. It's the idea of having 5 seconds in which to make a call, and instead of spending 4.9 seconds thinking, I could do this, but I also could do this, and would that be perfect, and would there be a flaw with that, and what do you think of this? Going, I've got 5 seconds to make this call. Okay, what's possible? Which is possible to do right now? fifth second, we do it now. That's like the difference in terms of how to make the choice. Therefore, he's not met with this indecision at the end or this hesitation. He makes the call and you live with the consequences. And if it doesn't work out, you hope that by studying the game back and seeing what happened in the game, positive and negative, the next time you make a better call in that moment. But the mechanism of the decisive call has always been a hallmark of High's shot calling. And so he hasn't always had the perfect plan or the response to what was happening in the game. But there has always been this logic or rationale that you could intuit, that you could ask him about in an interview, that you could hear him talk about later, that fit in with his philosophy of how to play the game. And as such, because of this decisive nature, and the fact his teammates can trust in that, means that you get everyone onto the same page. So even when they have the weaker roster, a weak roster that are all on the same page, absolutely in League of Legends and most team sports, can be a much more skilled team individually who aren't playing on the same page, who have differing ideas or who have an element of hesitation and second guessing within their makeup and how they operate in terms of their shot calling, their modus operandi. He's someone who has repeatedly shown this fast decision making. So he's decisive, but he's also fast. Like the way High shot calls is almost like the speed chess approach. It's like I make a move now, and actually the speed and decisive nature of my move puts the pressure on you to make a move. And then when you make a move, I'm immediately reacting really quickly, and you might get drawn into the battle of thinking, right, well, I've got to react as quickly. But if that's not your skill set, that then weakens you and gives me the edge. And if you don't react at all, if you wait longer, now I could be making more moves, and now you're putting under more pressure. So this style, it's not going to work against everyone. There will be people who can withstand it. I mean, there's fantastic defensive teams at times in League of Legends history, but it's going to work against a lot of teams, especially those middle-of-the-ground teams. They're the teams that are going to get torn up. So one of the things that's amazing to me about High's style of play and his shot calling is that because of this nature, these qualities that it's embodied and imbued over the years, it's been someone where even when he was on those lesser teams, when Cloud9 wasn't the best team anymore, when they weren't the best team mechanically anymore, when they were a team that actually, eventually, he wasn't even that good as a player in some of the other positions he played, and his teams shouldn't really, by any rights, have even been getting to Worlds and having chances there. Even in these scenarios, I always found it enjoyable to watch him play because there was a logic to it. There was a rationale. It made sense what was happening in the context of how he thinks about the game. So actually, even when they lost, I could find it enjoyable to see, I just missed that little thing there, or it's an interesting idea what he did before, but they didn't quite execute it properly, or he actually made a misstep. He didn't do the correct response there, but I can see what he was thinking. There's an intellectual stimulation to watching them play the game, beyond just watching good individual players make an okay move or fumble their way into a nice move, which is not that everyone does that. There's obviously a spectrum here, but he's very much more on the intellectual end of it. Whether he actually consciously thinks these things or whether he's just got this great intuitive understanding for the game, I don't really know the guy personally, so I can't really speculate too much in that respect. And so when you watch him play and he shot calls, you can see kind of the plan starting to form. You can see it being executed. You can see how it unfolds beyond that, and then what the responses are, and then how he'll respond to the response. Because obviously it's great to have a plan that's good, but then you've also got to be able to adapt to what comes at you next. And that's the part you can't, in essence, plan for. You have to react to that in some sense and already have it in your DNA, within your understanding of the game, what to do next in that scenario. Whether it's a very basic flowchart approach, or whether you are someone who is going to create something out of nowhere, whether you're going to be improvisational in your nature. And he's shown himself able to do both, actually. And so I've always found, especially some of those earlier lamps, like the Season 4 one's probably my favorite overall, because it was just this chess match back and forth of what he's doing and then what the opponent does. And sometimes the opponent, they're not necessarily doing it all as a unit and as a shot caller. They might just make a great individual play back. And seeing, especially in Season 4, that era when it's like Cloud9 could lose the game. They could lose team fighting. They could lose lane. But it felt like the sheer the percentage of how often they made the correct decision on a response, a macro response of what to do, and then losing a situation and then coming up with a plan that gives them a chance to get back in the game was unbelievable. And it really made it a pleasure to watch. And there was a lot to be gleaned from it and to be figured out, and more going on than just the raw, flashy aesthetics of the game itself and high skill that you see in League of Legends. It's also a guy where his teams have never been slaves to the meta in that sense. I mean, in Season 3, obviously, they flaunted it massively and had their own picks at different positions that no one was using. Part of the reason why you couldn't ban out the Season 3 Cloud9 is, okay, let's say you had banned out Zac and Nasus from Meteos. Okay, well, it's not like Rumble's the only pick that everyone uses top, but balls, if you let him on rumble, is going to win a ton of games. If Sneaky and Elimination, who the fuck is banning Ashe and Zyra? No one. But if you give them it, Sneaky's amazing at landing the arrows. That bot lane somehow just works. And obviously by the time Worlds comes around, actually has some relevance in terms of the Zyra pick, obviously. So this is one of the scenarios. His team, then that was an extreme example. But ever since, they've always shown themselves to seemingly pick the champion based on its utility, its functionality, for what they as individual players and as a team want to be able to do. Not because it's incredibly powerful or it counters this or it's just so good at this point in the game. It never felt like they were slaves to the meta in that particular sense. I also think that this kind of understanding that he has of his team's limits, this is a key thing. He understands his team's limits and their strengths, and therefore ruthlessly decides upon the win conditions and the plan you're going to engage. Because there's no point having a plan that's an amazing plan, it's a perfect response to the opponent, but you actually don't have the ability yourself to pull it off, and your team can't pull it off, and you don't have the tools to pull it off. In that scenario, yeah, you're going to look awesome, you're going to look like you're a genius and they couldn't pull it off, but actually it's not going to be good. There might be a plan that's not as good, it's not as effective, but it's better for your team and what you have in this scenario. And what's great is I can understand how he got that sense in a team concept, because it seems like he always had that as an individual player, particularly when he was a mid laner. Obviously, the other positions, he's never been a support for most of his career. He was a jungler very early on, but he wasn't a very good jungler back in Season 2. So you look at these periods, when he was a mid laner, primarily is how I'm thinking of his level of play. And this philosophy was mirrored there, because he played to his skills, he played up to what he was capable of, his skill set, but then he didn't go beyond that. He didn't overextend, and as a result, he wasn't a liability outright. Now, obviously, he was a liability in terms of a pure mid laner versus mid laner laning against world-class mid laners. Yes, in that sense, he had to be a liability, because that's a position where you're not just going to fuck around in that particular sense. But, with that said, you have to also consider that most of his other lanes weren't at a level of elite Asian players in those carry positions. And so if he had have had some god-tier monster top laner and a god-tier AD carry, in that point in time, maybe he even could have survived as a not-so-good mid laner. I mean, the obvious example to give would be like Season 5 Kuro. At that point in time, Kuro was not as good as he got in Season 6 when he very much shored up his game and obviously had a jungler at that point in time. In Season 5, he could be a liability. He only had a few champions he could really have any chance as just like an outright laning mid laner, just to perform as one of the traditional carries. It was mainly about just not being a liability and helping his team survive, because obviously they had a fantastic bot lane and they had a godlike top laner who, for my money, has been the best in the world for at least 2 years. Absolutely unbelievable player, individually and for the team. So if he'd have had that high, maybe he would even have succeeded at a higher international level, even with his own limitations as a mid laner, despite the fact that is traditionally, I've mentioned this in other videos, the role that has the bias in the game, that can usually carry more so than others at every point in time. So he's a very, very unique individual in terms of this shot calling prowess, because as much as he could explain to someone how to shot call and maybe bring their level up a bit or give them some concepts, you can't teach that style. You can't teach that skill set. There's something more to it. There's something that goes beyond just if you could write out on paper, well, if I do this, then I do this. It's the ability to know that. It's the ability to come up with that. It's the ability in the moment to be able to apply that, no matter whether you could do it if you had half an hour outside the game, if you can do it in 5 seconds in the game. There's something special there in terms of Hai, and what we've seen season after season after season. The guy's been playing like 4 seasons now. This is pretty crazy stuff in terms of the LCS level, obviously. I mean, I've always said a general principle that I've really worked on over the last few years. I mainly got it from Counter-Strike, where it's obviously a team-based game that has a lot of communication and people communicate in their native language. So in theory, they can speak and understand each other as well as you could naturally imagine of esports professionals. And I noticed that there were many really good teams that if you heard their comms, they actually didn't communicate as much as some of the lesser teams. Now, that's because, this is the philosophy I've kind of developed myself, overt vocal communication in many team circumstances and contexts acts as an artificial attempt to bridge a lack of understanding, a gap in knowledge, a gap in how team play would operate, how you're going to play and then I'm going to play and then what we're going to do together. That's what you're trying to vocally communicate. So people who happen, and this happens very rarely, but when it does, it's amazing. So Fnatic in CSGO in 2015 is a great example. Gambit, Moscow 5, Season 2, Season 3, obvious example. When you have this amazing natural chemistry where somehow it just works, you don't have to vocally communicate as much. It naturally is there. The intuitive understanding of what the guy's going to do is there. So you don't need as much of the artifice of the vocal communication. In some sense, the vocal communication is like a scaffolding around it in that particular sense. So I actually think just purely for his shot calling alone at this point in the game, he is still worth his weight in gold. I mean, the only person I can really think of in the West at the moment who is quite as comparable is probably Afromu. He's another person. I mean, in his case, he's still very good at his position, but he's another person where at least over the, I mean, in his case, not 4 seasons, 3 seasons, 2.5 seasons, shown himself to be a very good shot caller with lesser teams as well, and sometimes lesser talents. Similar sense in that, but not quite on the level of high quite yet. So I wouldn't necessarily even put him as high as that. But they're both, I think, I'd give him a blank check if I didn't have a player like this in my team. I'd want them immediately. So there are other players who have good qualities. Like, for example, Mithy has developed some great shot calling. But personally, I put Mithy's strength still to this day. I think his unique strength, and one thing that makes him amazing, is if you have a good AD carry, he's a guy you send the blank check to. Because every AD carry he has ever played with, for my money, has been improved by playing with him. Now, sure, of them all, the only one that maybe was better when he wasn't with Mithy was maybe Tabs when he was in Alliance. But that's because also he was very new to being AD carry when Mithy took him over in Lemon Dogs. All the others, for my money, in general, he's the one who got them to the elite level. He's the one who raised them. He's the one who taught them in the lane how to play beyond just being very skilled or guys who were able to just play one-dimensionally and bully the lane or whatever it might be. He's the guy who's got them to that next level. So he's someone who has his own unique qualities that's very good. Now, in terms of high, this is one of those areas where I actually am glad someone like me actually is around in esports, because there's obviously not many people have been in many different esports games and know many of the different esports games well or to a deep extent. Because actually there's a fantastic analog comparison point to high, but it's in a totally different game. It's actually in Quake Live, which is basically like the modern version of Quake 3. It's obviously a very old school game, and it's a 1v1 duel game in the mode that we're talking about. And the player who's an analog to high in this shot calling respect and planning and able to read the game, I would actually say is the player Rafa, the North American. He's Quake champion. It's a 1v1 game, obviously, so you don't rely on teammates. Because the thing is, he was never the most skilled player at any point during his championship runs, which is like 4 or 5 years long. He was never, for 1 second in 1 day, the most skilled player. That never happened. And yet, Quake is known as a mechanically demanding game, which rewards mechanical skill. By the way, more so than a game like League of Legends and even Counter-Strike. So not only was he not that skilled, but he was playing, and his whole peer group of the other potential champions and the other champions of his era were mechanical monsters. He was playing players who have like signature weapons at which they might be the best in the history of the game. Like, obviously, Cypher had probably the best rockets of all time. Avec had an unbelievable plasma gun. Cooler, at one point in time, a long time ago, incredible lightning gun. These players had all the skills in that sense, and he was able to battle them, to compete with them, to outthink them, to defeat them, and to become, at one point in time, a greater champion than them. Now, they're all champions in their own right, and later on, I postulate that Cypher superseded him, but for this period of time, he managed to do it, and in that sort of a context. So this is why I make him the analog to high. It's that ability to have potentially less and less resources to work with, and to get more out of it than your opponent who has more resources but can't get as much, therefore actually ends up eclipsed by you. You end up the victor, and what you do has a higher chance to succeed. And this is why I'd consider it, because Rafa beat those guys with his mind. He read the game, he constructed plans, he used his skills to limit, but not go beyond the limit, you know? And also, just like High, it's like he almost never lost a game, it felt, like just because he was worse. He could be outplayed, he could make the wrong decision, the opponent could play at an incredible level and go above and beyond, but he always brought that bar, that level, and you had to go above it. And that's what I feel like, this is why I've made the video now, because now that I've seen him in FlyQuest, where, you know, a bunch of those players, a lot of people would have said they should be retired. A bunch of these, he doesn't really have the star talents in the same way he's had in some of the past teams. He doesn't even have a Jensen anymore. But this is a guy now where you're just seeing, as a result, take away all the strengths and make them even more reduced. And now you see how he can make up the gap for you and make you a really competitive team and make you a team that can actually do something in this league. So this is a guy where it feels like he doesn't lose the game in that same kind of sense and make the massive blunder. He plays to a certain level, and if you are Cloud9 like they were in that NALCS match recently, yeah, maybe you can go above it. Maybe you can he hits you with the punch and you hit him with the counter knockout. That can happen, certainly, but he forces you up to that elite level because he is one of the best shot callers League of Legends has ever seen.